Welcome to Steve Nallon's Ghost Stories. This episode, it's What She Would Have Wanted, a modern tale of ashes to ashes and dust to dust. It's What She Would Have Wanted. What was the inspiration behind this tale?
Well, unusually, the inspiration for this tale actually came from about 40 years ago. And I was in my early 20s. And now I had lost my mother when I was very young, and my grandmother, who partly brought me up, she had Alzheimer's, and I sort of slowly lost her. So I never really had a mother figure in my life in my 20s. But I noticed that friends of mine did. And even though they were, buying houses for the first time and all that sort of stuff, their mothers were still quite a sort of a dominant influence on them, over them, whatever you want to say. And I just had this sort of image that came into my head of a mother turning up at her son's house with some sort of trinket and putting it on the mantelpiece and saying, "This will look nice there."
So the story behind the story of It's What She Would Have Wanted.
Well, this again goes back a long time, because on Radio 4, there used to be a series called Ladies of Letters. And it starred Patricia Routledge, was one of the ladies, and Pernilla Scholes. I'm so sorry to keep you. Anyway, they did this series, and it lasted for quite a long time on Radio 4. And I quite liked the epistolary format, and I thought I could update it to emails. And I liked all the offstage characters that they had. And as far as the ghost element in my story, I read this book, which is not a collection of Roald Dahl stories, but a collection that he liked. And he basically said, the best ghost stories don't have ghosts in them. At least you don't see the ghost. Instead, you see only the result of their actions. Now, it occurred to me that that's an interesting way of telling a ghost story, and it's partly true in my collection. Visiting the cat, visiting Hattie, not the cat, visiting Hattie. Well, getting the mix up in my head. Visiting Hattie and Who Fed the Cat. You don't actually, physically sort of see the ghost. In others, you do. The Ghost Light and I Was Once a Haunted House. You get little flashes anyway. I just thought it would be an interesting way of telling a story, and in some ways, the character I was interested in most in my little story was the mother character, who is essentially off camera, off screen, off stage. As I say, I don't think it's a personal story that comes from my own life, but I hope it sort of resonates with other people that can sort of recognize that sort of controlling mother, because I think that moment where a son becomes a husband is a really interesting one. And the husband really should be from then on the most important. But sometimes the husband lets the son aspect of himself become, they keep it too long. And I know that, we all talk about the wife's mother being the butt of the joke in sort of comedians and stuff. But I think the husband's mother is an interesting character. And I think we're going to, and I was thinking of The Anniversary with Bette Davis with the eye patch, and it's sort of a black comedy, and how the sons in that never give up their status as a son. But anyway, an interesting other thing about the story was that I sent it off to a couple of people, and somebody came back to me and said, well, it's got a really down ending, and it left a nasty taste in my mouth. That's what she said to me. She said it leaves a really nasty taste in your mouth. So I went away and thought about it, and I made it much more of a reconciliation story.
Right.
And so now I think I hope anyway, it's become a story where you learn to understand somebody better by discovering their history. and what made them who they are. So it's a very short story, and I'm sort of claiming a lot for my little short story, which is told through emails. But I do think the mother character is the sort of most interesting person in the tale, even though you don't see it.
Yeah. No, it resonates, doesn't it? Because I think the mother being in control of more than she had been traditionally, because of in terms of like generationally, because of the war. So, for example, taking on more male roles, traditionally male roles, and then having that sort of control of the family and what happens with the children and things like that can continue into adulthood. But then equally in modern times, there's the other side of that, which is where young people tend to stay at home longer and not necessarily strike out on their own as early. So you've got you've got two very different generations where this would actually resonate with, which I think is quite unique for a story, because they're very, very different generations, but it speaks to certain people. So for me, my parents are parents of my dad was the tail end of the war and peacekeeping as an active participant, so to speak, but it was all about the mother in the house while the fathers were off doing the thing. And that means that my grandparents, definitely I can recognize elements of my grandmother in this story, in this relationship, and I think it's fascinating. I think a lot of people will think exactly the same.
Well, it's not giving a lot away to say that the mother character dies and essentially, she's the ghost. But that sense of controlling from beyond the grave is even worse than controlling, as it were, in real flesh and blood life.
For sure.
And trying to find a way in which that could be stopped. As I say, originally I stopped it in quite an unpleasant way, and then I rethought it, because I think it's that balance between letting go and holding on, all relationships need to find it. And I think the character in my story, the mother character, she's obsessed by knickknacks and material stuff. But she had a childhood where she never had anything.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's often the sort of a psychological. You've got to have a psychological understanding of why people sort of do what they do. And I reread it. I wrote it several years ago, and I reread it, and although it was actually shorter than I thought that it sort of packed a lot in.
So this episode's extract reading. Steve, tell us a little bit about what we've got in store.
Well, I've already given away something that happens, and that is that the mother dies, but they get the ashes back in an urn. But then the urn doesn't want to stay where it's put, and neither do the ashes.
Tuesday, 15th April, 1517. Hi, Fiora. Oh, the strangest thing. That urn with Janet's ashes has turned up as you said it would, but guess where? Remember I told you about that Marie Antoinette Toby jug and how Janet brought a small side table to put it on? Well, now the mahogany box with Janet's ashes has taken over that exact spot. And poor Marie Antoinette has been relegated to the windowsill. But here's what's weird. I didn't move it or put it there, and John said it wasn't him either. Oh, bewitched, bothered and bewildered. Sonia. Tuesday, 15th April, 22:09. Don't stress yourself. There'll be a simple explanation. There always is with these things. Fiora. Wednesday, 16th April, 0911. Now it's getting beyond weird. Janet's urn has disappeared from its pedestal. She was there at 8:10, and I know that was the exact time because the news on Radio 4 had just finished, and that's when I switched over to Radio 2. Believe me, it was there an hour ago, but now it's vanished. And there's been no one in the house except me. Don't call the men in the white coats just yet. I suppose it could be just my mind playing tricks. Wednesday, 16th April, 11:08. Am I going mad? The good news-ish is that the mahogany urn with Janet's ashes has returned. In the kitchen next to the recycle bin. But the bad news, at least for my sanity, is that when I opened the box, it was empty. Where's Janet now? Wednesday, 16th April, 14:08. Just noticed that the black lacquered box with the red rose on the lid has moved from its place on the coffee table and is now on the mantelpiece next to Janet's harp clock. Fiora, I'm too frightened to lift the lid. I know her ashes are going to be in there. It's her, Janet. She's doing all this. Wednesday, 16th April, 15:09. Sonia, calm down. Don't be silly. Open the box. Nothing's going to be in there. Holding your hand as you take a big breath, Fiora. Wednesday, 16th April, 15:29. The ashes. Janet's ashes are in the black lacquered box. I knew they would be. And as I opened the lid, that harp clock began to play. We'll meet again. She's back.
Bates is judged and restored to sanity.
It's 22 years later, and Norman Bates is coming home. Psycho 2.
This episode's film pairing, as we've just seen in the trailer, is Psycho 2. And, well, this is one that sometimes goes under the radar. We all talk about Psycho as a bona fide masterpiece, and this is the one I always think of if you liked the character of Norman Bates and you felt you didn't get enough of him in the first one, then you get a lot more of him in the second one. And it's, you know, to sort of break down some of the story elements without giving too much away if people haven't watched it. But bearing in mind, I think we're past the point of spoiler territory here. But it's Norman Bates. He receives notes and phone calls from someone claiming to be his dead mother. And this sets off a chain of doubt and paranoia and incredibly well-performed emotional unraveling by Anthony Perkins. Someone I think people might find more now because of Osgood Perkins making a name in horror with Longlegs and The Monkey, that maybe people will hopefully go back and look a little bit more at Anthony Perkins and his work. Certainly someone whose life story is as interesting as the films that he was in. But this particular choice of film, Psycho 2, is all Norman Bates all the time. And that emotional unraveling, I think, is as a really lovely, subtle, unsettling sign. I say lovely in the kind of well done way rather than, oh, isn't that sweet? Unsettling signs that a deceased woman's presence still lingers, influencing the behavior of those they left behind. And I think this is perfect for me, perfect synchronicity with your story. I mean, in both works, from my point of view as a reader or a watcher or viewer, the question isn't whether the dead are reaching out, it's whether the living are using memories to control others. So there's a question there as well. Like, the ghost might not always be real in these stories and in these films, but the power it holds really is.
No, I think that's a perfect way of saying it, and it's that sense of the past having a hold on the present, and that's exactly what. And you're absolutely right about his performance. It's incredibly subtle, and you see the progression. When I first saw the film, when it first came out, and I thought it was a really good film. And I'm not going to do a spoiler with the twist, and the twist at the end really got me. I didn't anticipate that coming at all, and it's a yeah. There are lots of references to Psycho. In fact, I think there's some references to other sort of classic horrors as well. So it's having fun. It's having fun to a degree, but you're right. The past impinging on the present, or the person allowing the past to impinge on the present, because the sort of psychiatrist, talks about the importance of memory and all that sort of stuff. And memories are good, but they shouldn't control your life. And in the way that the mother character continues to do with Norman, and that sense that the mother character, and this is where you get into sort of Freudian-y stuff, when the whole sexual element comes in. The mother doesn't want him to have any sexual connection with somebody other than himself, other than herself, or that's another. But and I think that Oedipal stories, there aren't that many of them. But Manchurian Candidate, I think, is one. There's one I remember with called White Heat with James Cagney, with a very dominating mother. And actually one we've talked about before, and that is Hatchet for the Honeymoon.
Hatchet for the Honeymoon, yeah. There's a few, isn't there, really, that stand out, that are... There's a really uncomfortable one, which I would say is a great film, but not one I wouldn't watch a lot, called Spanking the Monkey, right? Which is a very hard watch, but it is incredibly well acted, and that is the ultimate. Even could it be even more uncomfortable, I think, than Norman Bates's relationship with his mother.
Often in horror stories, and I've recently been looking at this in haunted house stories, it's often the mother figure who's the most protective, the mother who's got the strong instinct, and you get that in films like The Others, and I think it's in The Conjuring and all those films, whereas it's the man who tends to sort of self-destruct. But the other thing about mothers is, a friend of mine said this to me, a comedy writer, and she said, Steve, mother-in-law jokes aren't about the mother-in-law. They're really about the way in which a man can make joke about his own mother. They're also mother-in-law jokes are also what they are. The husband is frightened that his wife will turn into. There's that aspect of it. But he said mother-in-law jokes are a real way of looking at doing jokes about mothers, and jokes about mothers are very difficult to tell directly. That's why it's done as an in-law. In horror, it's sort of breaking the taboo that you don't turn a mother into the horror figure. And I think it's in Hereditary where that is the most disturbing of all haunted house movies, in my opinion, in a way, because the maternal figure in that essentially destroys her entire family. In fact, sacrifices her entire. It's the grandmother ghost figure, and that really freaked me out when I watched that, because
that's it.
We all love mothers, that's what we do as soon as we're born. And therefore, to turn the mother into a monster is sort of breaking something that is incredibly sort of primeval in the way we think.
Yeah, it's a lot scarier than people might anticipate, that, because it's it's challenging the safe feeling, like, you know, we talk about like being the mother's bosom, you know, and being safe and looked after. But then the humorous side of that is where you kind of outstay your welcome and start behaving. You know, we've talked earlier on before we were recording a little bit about Sorry, and like how I said I couldn't really connect with it as a comedy that much because it just felt a little bit uncomfortable. And I guess that's the whole thing. Because what's going to happen is if that relationship is going to fracture, somebody has to challenge someone else and one person has to win. Otherwise, it's going to be a constant battle of wills for the rest of your life, which is a real tragedy. You know, where I can do this. I'm a big boy kind of thing.
Well, but it happens. I've seen it happen in so many lives where men in their 60s are still dependent in some way on their mothers, and I don't think it's healthy. I saw it with my own father. He lived with his mother because my mother died, his wife died, and she was a widow, so they lived together, and it was a very unhealthy relationship. But on a more positive note, on Psycho 2, changing the subject very quickly.
No, we've got right into the themes, haven't we?
the blood was good. And, you know, you don't get much blood. You don't get actual stabbings in Psycho, the Hitchcock one. But you do in this one. You get them everywhere and hands.
Oh, you really do. And Tom Holland, who wrote it, you know, you mentioned earlier on about how there's references or notices to other horror. You know, Tom Holland, the writer, obviously a massive fan of horror. This was one of his early films that he wrote. Went on to write Fright Night, went on to write the screenplay for Child's Play. You know, just somebody immersed in horror. A lot of people have, you know, a lot of reverence for him. To have the confidence to write a 1983 follow-up to Psycho and really go for it with the story and not just ape the first one, which a lot of people would do. I mean, Gus Van Sant even did ape the first one and shot by shot. But I think it's quite a brave film. And I think if people give it the chance, and I think maybe now, like certain films are being reassessed, people are starting to realize how good this film is.
Absolutely. So go and watch it.
Yes.
Well, Scott's artwork for It's What She Would Have Wanted is, again, actually, as you can see, it's a sort of Marie Antoinette Toby jug. And it's, again, where we were pretty much in perfect sync because he read the story and he's, you know, he thinks as an artist all the time. And he said the most interesting image in the story, because we don't actually see the ghost, is the Marie Antoinette Toby jug. And I'm going to make one. He said that there isn't such a thing.
I was going to say, do you have one? Like, no.
I don't think such a thing exists. And if it does, and somebody's found one on eBay, best of luck to them. But what I loved about it is it's incredibly subtle because you've got the guillotine is there, and it took me a while to spot the guillotine. And you've also got which becomes part of the plot behind the curtains, that I think it's the rhododendron bush. There's hints of flowers. So he's a great artist, but he also understands narrative, and he puts other elements of the story within it, not as clues exactly, but just adding a little bit of extra depth. And
I like the chin side of it as well. I like the little chins at the side.
And that's why, because I can wear this. I can wear this outdoors. I mean, the rats for I Was Once a Haunted House, I wouldn't wear outdoors, and I wouldn't wear sort of the Laughing Policeman, outdoors. But this is one I can proudly wear, in Waitrose. Without getting odd looks. Maybe I probably would get odd looks, but somebody might come, excuse me, can you tell me where I could buy that? I'd rather like it on my little windowsill.
So, Steve, the story pairing for this episode's tale.
Well, it's still mother and son, or son and mother, but very much at the opposite end of the scale. It's by a lady called Margaret Oliphant, and it's in all of these. It's probably the most popular anthology story that I've come across, called The Open Door. And without going into the whole plot too much, it's basically concerns a sort of wastrel son, a prodigal son, who leaves home, and then he comes back, but he comes back 2 days after his mother died, and she was a housekeeper in a big house, and he just keeps knocking on the door. Oh, mother, let me in. 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 And somehow this trauma, the spirit of that trauma, has imprinted itself in the sort of foresty area, and people keep hearing and sort of seeing this sort of ghost figure, this spirit figure that doesn't interact with them. So it's very much a sort of a reenactment, sort of story of an echo of the past, or trauma of the past. And there's a wonderful expression that somehow that had impressed itself upon the hidden heart of nature. And I love that. We we're quite used to the stone tape and tapes, and that somehow the spirit gets into the walls, but that it impressed itself upon the hidden heart of nature, I think is a wonderful line. Anyway, to cut a long story short, a minister comes along and basically asks God to allow the mother who has passed over to let her son inside. And that is sort of what happens, because the spirit of the son passes over. It's probably the most religious story that I've come across. Much admired it was by A.M.R. James, who talked about the religious aspect of it. But I've chosen it because it's the, in this occasion, the son really does need his mother, and it's an emotional contrast to my own story, and the other sort of stories that we've been talking about. And it's a very, very fine story as well, and because, which I've not mentioned yet, there's a lot at stake, because somehow the spirit of this prodigal son and his trauma has attached itself to the young boy in the family, and the young boy in the family is slowly dying. So you've got a lot at stake in the story. So they've got to allow this prodigal son, ghost, spirit, whatever you want to call it, to pass over, in order that the son they have in the family survives. Well, my obscure but fascinating fact comes from your film choice, Psycho 2. And when I watched it, I'd loved the film. But when I watched it again with the commentary, and something I hadn't spotted before, and that is there's a Hitchcock cameo appearance, incredibly brief and very, very subtle, as the shadow in a room. It disappears because she switches the light, or he switches the light on. I can't remember who does it, but it's a beautifully shaped Hitchcock, which is very similar to the Hitchcock Presents sort of silhouette.
Yes.
That was
very recognizable silhouette.
Very recognizable from the Hitchcock Presents silhouette, and it's a really nice, neat little touch that somebody somewhere along the line put in as a visual reference in the joke in the film.
Well, that's I didn't spot it. I did not spot it at all. But I am famous for missing everything. Any Easter egg, any hidden thing, I miss them all. But and people go, "Did you see that?" And I go, "Yeah, but no."
We all do that.
But
we all do that.
That one's great. Yeah, I'll put a picture up now on the screen. It'll be up on the screen for people to see. So yeah, that'd be cool. And maybe they can spot it. So mine is a little bit more abstract. It's just, I would say, a fascinating link, possibly more than a fascinating fact. So I was thinking about your story. It's what she would have wanted, and Psycho 2. And I think both feature characters haunted by women who may or may not be speaking from beyond the grave. But I think the key thing here is they both weaponize grief as a form of psychological manipulation. And weaponizing grief is something that I don't know if it's talked about, like we might talk about, Freud related things and, mothers, and really go down that avenue, which I think is done a lot. But in this case, weaponizing manipulation or weaponizing grief to manipulate, I think, is a really interesting avenue. So that was just my I suppose fascinating link, is weaponized grief. I don't know if that counts as a fact, but
wow, that's that. I thought you were going to say something like the city hall in the movie is the same city hall as in Back to the Future, which is but actually
that's
you've
amazing,
just made me. It's an interesting fact, but what you've just said actually resonates with something in my own family, and that is that my auntie, who looked after my grandmother, had a nervous breakdown when my grandmother died, and we never really sat down and chatted much before, but we did on that occasion, and she talked about my grandmother, her mother, monopolizing her own grief.
Wow.
And when my own mother died, my grandmother did monopolize her grief. And my auntie said, she never let me grieve. I had lost a sister, but she never let me grieve because her grief was paramount and above everybody else's. And part of her breakdown, and she went into hospital, was going through a grieving process for her sister, my mother, sort of 50 years after it had happened. So I think you've really hit something that is incredibly. My grandmother didn't weaponize grief in that sense, but she certainly used it in a very manipulative manner. And that was wow.
I didn't expect us to get as deep as that. I kind of did in a way because of some of the themes, but I definitely think that a lot of families, certainly kind of nuclear based families, and can kind of see that feeling of, this person is allowed to behave in this way, but this person has got far too much on their plate to actually be able to take time to think about themselves, or they're the person who gets on and does, and everybody else can kind of choose how they behave. And there's definitely those kind of people, and I think it speaks to them, doesn't it, that monopolization of grief, monopolization of feelings and emotions, which is actually a kind of horror, or a kind of, I guess, possibly unintentional or intentional, or just unthinking torture, which is
I think it's unthinking. I think my grandmother was unthinking, but it's ironic actually in what we've been talking about, because I always thought my story was the least personal of all the stories I've written, and yet I've probably been the most personal about my own family than I've been in any of the other. In any of the other videos that we've done. So it's turned into a therapy session.
I know. I'll lie down on the couch in a minute and you can start charging me. But I definitely think that you're right. I think that the issue with that, I suppose, is that maybe with distance and reading your own story, you can read it a bit more as a reader now, and notice those things that maybe you were putting in there. I know this is just a shot into that you were putting in there kind of without realizing you were putting them in there. People say write what you know, and sometimes we actively write what we know, but sometimes we can't help but write what we know.
Well, we write, I think, what we unconsciously know, but we don't know. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally.
We unconsciously know it, but we're not conscious that we know it, and somehow those echoes, themes, and ideas sort of somehow creep into the story. Well, I've sort of got two takeaways. One of which I sort of mentioned, and that is that balance in life between holding on and letting go. I love films like Truly, Madly, Deeply, and Always, where the ghost is there to help the person move on. But I also like Coco, where the ghost is saying, "Don't forget me," and it's that balance between the two. And the other sort of takeaway is, and that is when you come to a better understanding of somebody, when you discover the nature of their own childhood. So the mother in my story came from a very sort of working class background, and they wanted her parents wanted her to be successful, and she became successful because she sort of married a wealthy man, and all the things that she never had when she was a kid, she then started buying material stuff. And you find that a lot with very wealthy people who never had material goods as children. Barbara Streisand didn't have a dolly. She had a hot water bottle that she treated as a dolly. And now she has a street under her house. She's built a street under her house with doll shops. She's got hundreds of dolls.
She really? Oh my word!
And it's insane. But you can sort of understand it, because she said in interviews, I never had a dolly. All I had was a hot water bottle that I pretended was my dolly. And sort of there's an element of that within the mother in my story. But the point I'm making is that we discover why. We discover the history, and with that history comes a better understanding of the mother. So the wife in my story, when she discovers the backstory, she says, well, I understand now. I don't agree with it, but at least I understand it. So, and that's exactly what happens in the Margaret Oliphant, The Open Door. There's an understanding of where this need to be let back in came from. Anyway, that's a bit heavy.
No, that's really scary. What I find really scary about that is, and I mentioned to you this privately as well, is that maybe getting that backstory and it changing your opinion on somebody many years in the future is really scary. Like to have, or for something to be discovered about someone that you admired is a horrible fear that we all have, whether it's somebody we watched on television, whether it's somebody we read their books or listened to their music. But it's even worse when it's inside our family, and it might be somebody that we held in very high regard, and we realize that maybe they weren't as kind or weren't as gentle or thoughtful and were more selfish, or all of these things, because obviously all humans are flawed. We'll find out lots of things about people, but in terms of if they've done something particularly upsetting that makes you see them in a different light, and that for me is petrifying.
It was, and it happened again. It happened to me in my own family, because my grandmother was my heroine, and she is the character in my Swidgers novels. The granny figure is a sort of version of my grandmother. But her daughter said to me, after my grandmother died, she said, your grandmother just destroyed this family. And she went through as to why, from her perspective, she had been very, very destructive. She was my savior, but elsewhere in the family, she'd been very destructive. So I had to reassess. It's exactly what you've said. I had to reassess somebody I loved in a completely different light. And they were both true, and
that's the thing. They're both true. Somebody can be someone completely different to two different people. There is somebody in our family who nobody liked, and for good reason. Yet when I was a boy, he was the guy that I played Cowboys and Indians with, played Bonanza with. He was hilariously funny. I just spent hours of time with him. But everybody else, could not. There was no other tears shed, put it that way. And but my memory is true to me. Like I had no negative experiences. Other people definitely did. So it's really hard, and we're very judgmental on that when it's other people as well. How could you still like this person, or how can you support this person, or how can you still watch their films, or how can you? It's very easy to do that because your relationship is personal, and to judge that, I think, is very high and mighty, and quite unfair. Mine is very different. My take, my final take. I guess it's more theme based, but we've really dug personally into this story, and I found it fascinating. So we've explored a story where the dead don't rest quietly, and memory becomes a weapon, as we said earlier on. But I think it's the subtlety of your story that I take away of psychological horror. That psychological horror doesn't have to be big jump scares or certain types of music in a film or certain tropes. It can have guilt, it can have inheritance, it can have manipulation of power, even manipulation of nostalgia. And I go back and forth on nostalgia. I have periods where I collect everything, and then I get rid of them all, and then I regret it, and then I get them all back again. And because part of me doesn't want to just be constantly thinking that things from the past or things I would have liked to have had from the past are like my reason for being here. Like I'd rather be in the now. And I go back and forth on that. I mean, I have literally got a shelf full of Star Wars figures there. However, I had thousands of them at one point. And, nostalgia actually can have a manipulative power. Do you remember when? Do you remember when? And it can be exclusive. It can leave other people out who don't remember when. It can be a power game over, do you remember when I did this for you? Therefore, you need to do this for me. And I love this thought of all of those guilt, inheritance, nostalgia, all wrapped up in an elegant, almost theatrical form. So I feel that like this is a ghost story that is grounded in reality that we can all understand, and the power that someone can have after they're gone. And pairing that with Psycho 2, what if the monster is trying to heal? Like, that's what that film asks. What if a monster is trying to heal? Do we allow that? But the world won't let it. Both the story and the film, I think they blur those lines between grief and cruelty, being trapped by the dead, but also honoring them. So I don't say that people should go to bed tonight and sleep with one eye open, but maybe don't answer the phone if it's your mother.
Good day. This is Lady Thatcher talking down to you. Let me just say that next time on this channel, it will be me. Yes, yes, yes. Lady Thatcher in The Return of the Handbag.